excited to be able to speak here on our fourth and last weekend of this series, The Ripple Effect, as Dan said, where we're looking at the person of Jesus and then his character, ways, and mission. And as we begin our time together tonight, I actually wanted to start in one of my favorite novels. So if you don't know, I was an English major in college, love literature, and so I'm going to share a little bit of my favorite literature with you. And the reason I'm doing so is because this book and the beginning of it, I think it really helps to give shape to what we're going to be talking about. So the book is The Moviegoer by Walker Percy, published in 1961, National Book Award winner. I do recommend it. So, main character is Binks Bowling, and we catch his words here right at the very beginning about a conversation that he's going to have. Begins this way: "This morning I got a note from my aunt asking me to come for lunch. I know what this means. Since I go there every Sunday for dinner and today is Wednesday, it can mean only one thing. She wants to have a serious talk about me, about the future and what I ought to do. It's enough to scare the wits out of anyone." Why is the conversation that Binks' aunt wants to have with him enough to scare the wits out of anyone? Maybe it's because that conversation digs into one of his and maybe one of our deepest insecurities and our deepest questions. What are we supposed to do with our lives? Should I be a lawyer or a doctor? Should I be a chef or an artist? Should I stay in Pittsburgh or should I move to New York? Should I take the job that's going to pay me the most money, or should I take the job that's going to put me as close to my friends and family as possible? Should I be this major or that major? Should I be in this relationship or should I end it? Should I be working in the workforce or should I be working in my home with my children? Should I be a software manager or a youth pastor? Should I be at our Wexford campus or our Oakland campus? Those last two, if you don't know, those are my questions that I've recently had to work through. What are we supposed to do with our lives? What are our lives even supposed to be about? How do we know that we're doing the right things? How do we know that the path that we're on is the path that we're supposed to be on? Can we even know any of these things with certainty? In order to attempt to answer these questions, I'm going to first introduce and then describe a military term, commander's intent. Commander's intent is a term that's used as part of the U.S. military's detailed mission planning process. I first came across this term in a book that I was reading, and interested in learning more, I reached out to a good friend of mine, Rob Mercury, who attends our Wexford campus. Rob graduated from West Point, spent 5.5 years as a captain in the U.S. Army Intelligence Corps, and he seemed like a qualified person to talk to about this. And in our conversation, Rob described to me the detailed process that the Army uses in planning all of their missions. Planning everything from which units will be involved in a mission, to when and where communications will occur, to when and where resupply will occur, all the way down to the last piece of the planning process, which is known as commander's intent. Commander's intent provides every commanding officer and soldier with an overarching view of what the mission's purpose is and what needs to be achieved in order for the mission to be considered successful. Once the mission actually begins, a lot of what's been planned, no matter how detailed or diligent the planning, it gets kind of thrown aside because there are certain things that just simply cannot be predicted. And that's why commander's intent is there. It's so that when the plan has to be thrown out, when the details are no longer relevant, and we have to discard the plan that we had, we can still know what we're supposed to do. They can still know what their mission is. They can still know what all of their collective actions are supposed to achieve. So I'm going to come back to commander's intent later. But we're first going to look to the person of Jesus. We're going to look at his life, and we're going to see 4 things that he did in and through his life and ministry. And then at the end, we're going to take these 4 things, we're going to try to apply them to ourselves, and then we're going to see if we can come up with a few specific action steps. So the first of these 4 things that Jesus did in his life and public ministry. First, Jesus demonstrates what God is like. There's this scene in the Gospel of John. It involves Jesus and all of his disciples. It's actually the Last Supper. They're all sitting together around a table, and Jesus begins saying things to his disciples. He begins teaching them things. And some of the things that he's saying to them, he says, don't be troubled. Believe in God. Believe in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. I'm going to prepare a place for you. You know how to get where I'm going. And then Jesus says in John 14:6, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now one of the disciples, Thomas, bravely speaks up, and I think probably speaks something that at least a few of the other disciples were thinking, or at least what I would have been thinking had I been in that group. Thomas says to Jesus ultimately, he just looks at him and says, actually, we have no idea where you're going. And Philip then almost, another one of the disciples, seemingly just interested in maybe trying to push through all of this conversation, makes a suggestion to Jesus. And he says, well, Jesus, why don't you just show us the Father, and then we'll know what you're talking about and where you're going. And Jesus replies to Philip this way in John 14:9. Have I been with you so long and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? And really this is what we've been talking about over the past 3 weeks in this series. 2 weeks ago, Pastor Ken introduced us to the character of Jesus. Last week, Freedom introduced us to the ways of Jesus. And when we look to Jesus, we see his character. And when we look to Jesus, we learn his ways. And what Jesus is saying is that when we look to him, we actually see God's character and we learn God's ways. So Jesus demonstrates to all who will look to him what God is really like. The second thing we learn when we look at Jesus' life and what he did is that Jesus reconciles people to God. Matthew, in his gospel, he actually records the story of when Jesus called him to become one of his disciples. Matthew's a tax collector. In this scene, he's sitting at his tax booth, and Jesus walks by and calls out to Matthew and says, follow me. And Matthew says that he immediately gets up and follows Jesus, leaving behind all of his financial security and material wealth. And then the next thing that Matthew tells us is that he hosted a party at his house that Jesus attended, and then that we're told in the story that many sinners and tax collectors attended. And the Pharisees, they see that Jesus is at this party, and they can't understand why Jesus would be at this party with all of these tax collectors and sinners. So they go to some of Jesus' other disciples and they ask him in Matthew 9:11, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now the Pharisees considered the tax collectors and sinners to be the absolute dregs of Jewish culture and society. They were the lowest of the low, the most reviled of people. And they were even more confused, not only that they were such a low class and culture, but also the fact that in this culture, sitting together at a meal was a deep expression of intimacy between people. So they look at this party and they see that Jesus is here with the lowest of the low, and he's sharing a meal with them, sitting at a table with them. The Pharisees can't wrap their minds around this. And so Jesus, overhearing the question that the Pharisees ask, he just goes ahead and answers it in Matthew 9:12 and 13. But when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need for a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. The Pharisees would not have had to pull out their iPhones, load their Bible app to understand exactly what Jesus is saying here. He's quoting from Hosea 6:6, where the prophet teaches that God cares more deeply about his own people faithfully loving him and intimately knowing him than he cares about them blindly adhering to religious rituals. Jesus is pointedly instructing the Pharisees that God cares first and foremost about loving people and accepting people and seeing those people reconciled to himself. Jesus, in his life and public ministry, reconciles people to God. And he does it by freely offering love by freely offering acceptance. And through the free offer of acceptance and love, Jesus is offering forgiveness for sins. So now we've seen two of the four things that Jesus did in his life and public ministry. One, he demonstrates what God is like, and two, he reconciles people to God. Third, Jesus reveals God's kingdom on earth. If we stay in the Gospel of Matthew, but we actually just go back a little bit closer to the beginning of that Gospel, we find what's known as the Sermon on the Mount. The sermon is more or less a guide on how life is supposed to work in God's kingdom. And while the disciples and we don't yet fully live in God's kingdom, Jesus is attempting to provide instruction to all of his disciples and everyone or anyone who ever would become a disciple on how to orient their lives in this world. The sermon begins in Matthew chapter 5 with what's known as the Beatitudes, continues throughout chapters 6 and 7. And throughout these three chapters, Jesus is redefining and reshaping what his followers' attitudes, desires, ambitions, and relationships are supposed to be like in light of them now being citizens in God's kingdom. Blessed are those who are destitute of wealth, influence, and honor. Blessed are those who experience sorrow and grief. Blessed are those who have power and influence and don't use either to crush or oppress people. Blessed are those who freely offer mercy and compassion. Blessed are those who are blameless, sincere, and genuine. Blessed are those who love peace and seek to make peace. Blessed are those who are mistreated, harassed, and persecuted. For God will draw near to them, and they will know God's heart. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is describing the ways of life that govern God's kingdom. And he's instructing all of his followers on how to live out those ways of life in this world. And throughout Jesus' life and his public ministry, we see these kingdom principles lived out perfectly. Through Jesus' life, God's kingdom is revealed. So we've now seen three of the four things that Jesus did in his life and in his public ministry. He demonstrates what God is like, he reconciles people to God, and he reveals God's kingdom on earth. So we're now on to our fourth and final point. I'm going to state the point, I'm going to expound it a little bit, and then I'm going to settle in for a little while so we can have a conversation about what these things mean for your life and mine. So here's the fourth and final point. Jesus reproduces disciple makers. This is what the entire teaching series has been building toward. And this really is the place where the first three things that we talked about find their fulfillment and consummation. Jesus calls 12 disciples to follow him, and for 3 years he pours himself out on their behalf. And even though their maturation and spiritual formation is nonlinear and honestly oftentimes seems to be regressing, Jesus still succeeds in reproducing his character, ways, and mission in the life of his disciples. And I think it's here that we need to return to the questions that we started with. What are we supposed to do with our lives? What are our lives even supposed to be about? Through Jesus' life, we get a clear picture of what he did. He demonstrates what God is like. He reconciles people to God. He reveals God's kingdom, and he reproduces disciple makers. Can we know what we're supposed to do with our lives? And I think we can if we look to Jesus. We can if we allow Jesus to reshape our attitudes and our desires and our ambitions and our relationships. Even when we don't have all of the details figured out, even when we don't have all of the answers for the questions that we have, even when the plan that we thought we were executing needs to be thrown out altogether, we can still know what we're supposed to do with our lives. A few years ago, Harvard Business Review featured an interview with Admiral Allan of the United States Coast Guard. Admiral Allan led the response to the BP oil spill and Hurricane Katrina. And in the interview, he talks about the challenges that he faced leading the response to Hurricane Katrina. You may remember the initial response to Hurricane Katrina was coming under pretty hard, a lot of fire for just being very mismanaged and being slow to meet the needs of the people who were most desperately in need of being helped. Admiral Allan was not there from the beginning. He was brought in after things had started going badly, and he was tasked with trying to make it right. And in this interview, he describes what he did, the very first thing that he did when he took command in regards to responding to Hurricane Katrina. It says that he gathered about 4,000 people and hosted a meeting. And he says this, I got up on a desk with a loudspeaker and told everybody that I was giving one order. They were to treat anybody they came into contact with who had been affected by the storm like a member of their own family. Hopefully, they had healthy family relationships. Their mother, father, brother, sister, whatever. After I said that, a cheer broke out. Just a simple North Star to steer by was, I think, what they were looking for. Admiral Allan refers to his one order as a North Star to steer by. It was his commander's intent for his people. Do you see what commander's intent does? It takes all of the details and all of the planning and it captures it in one easy-to-understand statement. Confused about the details of the mission? Then treat everyone that you come across as if they were a member of your own family. It's straightforward and it's actionable. In light of not knowing specific details, in light of the plan having to be discarded, commander's intent remains and it provides guidance and direction. Maybe you don't know if you should be a lawyer or a doctor, or whether you should stay in Pittsburgh or move somewhere else, or which job to take, or whether or not you should be in the workforce, or working at home with your children. Maybe you don't know if you should be in that relationship that you're in. Jesus has still given us a North Star to steer by, and he has still given us his commander's intent for our lives. It's in Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. It reads, and Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. This is not a trite conclusion that's intended to advance the Northway Company line. Just want to get that out there. Even though we've been talking about making disciple makers for 2 years, I'm not just landing here in the Great Commission because if I didn't, Pastor Doug would never let me teach again. I'm landing here because Jesus' last words to his disciples and to us provide the commander's intent, provide the North Star to steer by that we all are searching for, so that we can know what to do with our lives when we don't have all of the details figured out, so that we can know what to do with our lives when we don't have answers to all of our questions, so that we can know what to do with our lives when the plan that we've been executing is no longer viable. Where should you work? I don't know. But I know that if you're faithful and obedient right where you are, you can make disciples. Where should you live? Should you be in that dating relationship? Should you be in the workplace or at home with your children? I don't know. But I do know that if you're faithful and obedient right where you are, you can make disciples. And in making disciples, you can make ripples that will affect eternity. When we're faithful and obedient right where we are, when we set ourselves about going and making disciples right where we are, the first three things that we talked about come into play. Through our lives, we demonstrate what God is like. Through our lives, we point people to Jesus who reconciles people to God. Through our lives and what we value, we can reveal God's kingdom. And as we do these things, we can make disciples who will make disciples. About 2 years ago, my wife and I purchased our house in the north side. We've been renting there since we got married about 5.5 years ago. And when we purchased that house, we had gone through a long season of prayer, really asking God, because we really envisioned ourselves wherever we buy a house, that is where we are planting our family. It was almost like marrying a neighborhood. And when we clearly knew down with Salim and basically just said to him over dinner, I said, so we bought our house. We're in. What should we do? And Salim looked at me and he was like, your generation, always wanting to do things. Don't move. Raise your family in that house. Get to know your neighbors. Share your life with them and stay. I remember going home after that dinner with Celine. Julie was waiting for me in our living room and she just asked me, she's like, so how did it go? And I was like, I don't know. I don't feel like he answered my question. And yet, 2 years later, we've discovered just how right he was. We set ourselves out about intentionally investing in our neighbors. Julia leads a women's small group of Northside moms. One of the moms in that group she met while at the playground. Julia took our children. This mom was there with her children. When Julia met her, she was a Muslim. Today she's a Christian, and so are her 2 children. I met a guy who leads a ministry for homeless men and women, and every few weeks I tag along with him and go and visit the different homeless camps where these men and women live, and we pray for them. I am very slowly making progress with our neighbor who's an executive at a company downtown. And something that's really encouraging to us is that we're not the only people in our community who are doing this. Pastor Doug and Amy have been doing this with their family in friendship for years. We saw the video. Allison Smith is living this out right here in our community, and we know that so many of you are also doing that. But just for a moment, can we dream? What would it look like if the 600 or so people who call Northway Oakland their home made the decision to intentionally invest in your neighborhoods and in our city over the long haul? What kind of ripple effect would our intentional investment in our neighborhoods have in the city of Pittsburgh over the long haul? So I mentioned earlier that I was going to provide a few specific action steps. I want to do that right now. So first, we've been talking about this for a few weeks, but next week we start this new series called 4 Questions. This is not a shameless plug for our teaching series. The things that we're going to be talking about in this series are actually things that are obstacles to people believing in God and trusting Jesus with their lives. These are actually things that hinder people from being in a relationship with God. One of the things that we heard this weekend as people were being baptized was how one invitation to come to church led to this faith in Jesus and a decision to be baptized. You have the opportunity to extend one invitation and invite somebody to our next series, to one of these different weeks, to hear one of these different topics. And just by doing that, you could begin the process of somebody being reconciled to God. We've got on your seats on your way in, and Pastor Doug mentioned this at the beginning of the service, you've got our transformational outreach brochure. And then there's also LAMP, which is our learning and mentoring partnership. Just to talk about these 2 things real briefly. In this transformational outreach brochure, it lists all of our local and global mission partners. Everybody that we partner with in ministry, locally and globally, is listed here. If you want to get involved in a local ministry, this is the place to start. Contact information is in here. If you're shy about shooting an email to somebody that you don't know, we have a guy on staff named Pat Michael who can send the email for you. If you're interested in a mission trip, we're doing one in March. We're going to Nicaragua to see Dan and Jasenia Bain, who you saw in the video at the beginning of the service. And then LAMP. There will be a LAMP representative in the lobby after the service. People at all of our campuses are making the decision to intentionally invest their lives in the life of students in Homewood. And we're seeing radical transformation in the lives of these students. So just by getting involved in one of these outreach opportunities, or maybe making the decision to get involved with LAMP, you could begin the work of revealing God's kingdom in someone's life, showing them the ways of God's kingdom and the values of God's kingdom. And then lastly, this has been in your notes each week throughout this series. It's our Ripple Effect Challenge card. There's 5 different opportunities for you. This is all specifically aligned with that last point of reproducing disciple makers. 5 different opportunities. You can go through Prepare, which is a 4-week study that helps you understand the foundational aspects of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. You can do that on your own or with a friend, or you can do that in an on-site small group that starts in 2 weeks. I will be leading one of those groups. Pat Michael will be leading another one. You could go through Discipleship Journey or Discipleship Essentials with a friend. That's the material and the resource that Allison and Cookie and Elizabeth were all talking about in the video at the beginning of our service. You can attend a Making Disciple Makers Lab on our campus. This is a 4-week environment that's specifically designed to help all of us overcome that fear of, I don't know what to do. I don't know how I would do it. I don't know what I would say. This is going to walk us through all of the different resources that we can use. This is going to walk you through what an actual meeting between 2 people would look like, how to lead a conversation. It's about having relationships with people. And then lastly, you can attend the Jesus Blueprint Seminar, where you can just learn more about what it really means to be a disciple who makes disciples. Now, as your pastors, Pastor Doug and I, we're charged with and we are held accountable for serving you well, pointing you to Jesus, building you up, and equipping you for the work that you have been created and purposed to do. And that's the why to this whole series, and that's the why to these different opportunities that I just went over with you. Jesus looked at his disciples and said, go and make disciples. And so we're looking at you and we're saying, do the same thing. Go and make disciples. And this is where Northway has been since the very beginning. The original 9 couples believed that our neighbors' lives and our city's trajectory could be radically altered if we would just live our faith out well, love people well, and make disciples. And I think sometimes we look back on those original 9 and we think that they must have been some sort of spiritual giant, like an X-Men of the faith. And I married into one of those families, and I can assure you they are wonderful people who love Jesus, but they are not like superhuman. They're just people who are faithful and obedient, who radically set themselves out about the mission of Jesus and living that out well. And you can see the impact of what that has done in our city. 5 campuses, 4,000 people on a given weekend. And ever since our very beginning as a church, we have been faithfully and obediently and oftentimes imperfectly attempting to build God's kingdom one disciple at a time. If you want to be doing with your life what Jesus is doing with his, and you're not sure where to start, start with these opportunities that we just went over. Maybe you don't know the details to your life. Maybe you don't have all of the answers to your questions. Maybe your plan just got blown up, and I know that that is frustrating and disconcerting. Even still, seek to make disciples where you are. Seek to reproduce disciple makers just like Jesus did. We point people to Jesus, who demonstrates what God is like, who reconciles people to God, who reveals God's kingdom on earth, and by his authority and his command, we get to do with our lives what the Savior of the world did with his. We get the opportunity to make an eternal impact in the lives of people by reproducing the character, ways, and mission of Jesus, and then expecting them to do the same. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much that we got to be together as a community tonight, that we got to stand together and sing praises to you who are so worthy of our praise. Father, that we were able to participate as an entire church body with 11 people who made the decision to be baptized this weekend. Father, thank you that we have the opportunity to come face to face with your word, to be challenged by it. And Father, I pray that your Spirit might be nudging us to respond in some way. Father, to really set ourselves about your mission. Father, we all want to be a part of something big, catch your vision. May we be faithful and obedient to what you've told us to do. We love you and pray this in your Son.